We're going to move on to smooth muscle now. So smooth muscle is called that because it looks smooth. There are no striations or stripes on it, and so we'll see why that is in a minute. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of all the hollow internal organs in the body, except for the heart. So we find smooth muscle in the walls of the GI tract, the bladder, uterus, airways, and then also surrounding the walls of the blood vessels. That's also smooth muscle. Another thing that is really different about smooth muscle from skeletal muscle is that it's under involuntary control. So it's going to be innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons will innervate smooth muscle. Another thing that's really different from skeletal muscle is that hormones can cause smooth muscle to contract. You will not see that in skeletal muscle. So for example, the hormone oxytocin will cause uterine contractions. Paracrines, remember these are chemicals that are released and talk to neighboring cells. Paracrines such as nitric oxide, which are released by the endothelial cells that line the inside of the blood vessels, will cause the smooth muscle around the blood vessels to contract. And finally, stretch can also make smooth muscle contract. So for example, in the GI tract, like if your stomach gets really stretched with food, that will stimulate the smooth muscle to contract. Smooth muscle cells are very small compared to skeletal muscle fibers. They only have one nucleus, and that's compared to the multinucleated skeletal muscle cells. The other thing that's very different about smooth muscle is there's no striations or stripes, and that's because there are no sarcomeres. So you will not have A bands and I bands in smooth muscle. So the reason this is because the actin and myosin are arranged differently. Let's just take a look at some pictures. So here's looking at the myosin in green. And you can see that the myosin heads are laid down vertically along the length of the thick filament. And remember in skeletal muscle, they were laid down horizontally. So in the thick filament and the smooth muscle, there's no bare middle. There's myosin heads the entire length of the thick filament. And that makes it so that smooth muscle can contract whether it's squished up or if it's really stretched out. It can still have a strong contraction, and that's very different from skeletal muscle, which remember if you remember that length tension curve, it has to be at that optimal length of the sarcomeres to get a strong contraction. So the actin and myosin, they're going to be attached to what are called dense bodies, and there's no Z lines. And you can see that the thin and thick filaments, they kind of spiral around the smooth muscle cell. So that means that when the thin filaments slide over the thick filaments and the smooth muscle cell contracts, because the actin and myosin kind of spiral around it, the smooth muscle cell will twist up as it contracts. Another big difference with smooth muscle compared to skeletal muscle is that smooth muscle, most of the calcium for contraction comes from the extracellular fluid. Smooth muscle cells have very little sarcoplasmic reticulum. And remember, that's very different from skeletal muscle cells because all of the calcium came from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Another big difference with smooth muscle is that there's no troponin, so our cowboy is gone. So calcium is going to bind to a different protein called calmodulin in smooth muscle cells. When calcium binds to calmodulin, that's going to activate an enzyme called myosin light chain kinase, and then that will activate the myosin heads. Another big difference with smooth muscle cells compared to skeletal muscle cells is that the myosin head enzyme ATPase works very slowly. So it's going to be a very slow cross-bridge cycle and a very slow contraction speed. So excitation contraction coupling in smooth muscle is fairly different from skeletal muscle that we looked at before. So there's going to be some sort of stimulus for letting calcium into the smooth muscle cell. So remember that most of the calciums for contraction is going to come from the extracellular fluid. So there's a number of different ways that we can let the calcium into the smooth muscle cell. We can open up some voltage-gated calcium channels if an action potential is started at another smooth muscle cell and passes through gap junctions. It can open these voltage-gated calcium channels. We also have ligand-gated calcium channels, which maybe a neurotransmitter from a sympathetic or parasympathetic neuron binds to, or maybe a hormone binds to it and opens it. And then mechanically gated calcium channels, those are going to be opened by stretch. So especially in like the GI tract, those are found quite frequently. So we're just going to go and look at a picture to show excitation contraction coupling in smooth muscle cells, but it's all written out here for you. In excitation contraction coupling in smooth muscle cells, remember that most of the calcium is going to come from the extracellular fluid. Only a very small amount comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum because it's not very well developed. So once calcium comes into the cell, it's going to bind to a protein called calmodulin. There's no troponin in smooth muscle cells. The calcium calmodulin will then activate an enzyme called myosin light chain kinase. And remember that kinase enzymes, they phosphorylate things. So myosin light chain kinase is going to phosphorylate the myosin heads, and then that will activate the myosin heads. They will then be able to reach up, grab onto the thin filaments and start doing the cross-bridge cycle and sliding the thin filaments over the thick filaments and contracting the smooth muscle cell. So with this picture, on the left shows contraction that we just talked about, showing how most of the calcium is going to come in from the extracellular fluid. It's going to bind to that protein calmodulin, and then the calcium calmodulin will activate the enzyme myosin light chain kinase, which will then phosphorylate the myosin heads. They are now active. They can now bind to the thin filaments, start the cross-bridge cycle, and start contracting the smooth muscle cell. In order for the smooth muscle cell to relax, we need to do two things. So one is we need to get rid of all the calcium, so most of it gets pumped back out into the extracellular fluid where it came from. And then we're going to use another enzyme, phosphatase, to dephosphorylate the myosin heads. So once the myosin heads are dephosphorylated, they can no longer bind to the actin, and they will let go, and then the thin filaments will then slide back to their original position and the smooth muscle cell will relax. Smooth muscle is innervated by the autonomic nervous system, so sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. And remember that it's not the neurotransmitter that determines the response, it's the type of receptor that's on the smooth muscle cell that is going to determine whether it contracts or relaxes. Remember that the parasympathetic and sympathetic postganglionic neurons, when they synapse with the smooth muscle cells, remember they have those varicosities where they are going to release the neurotransmitter from. There's two different types of smooth muscle. Most smooth muscle is going to be single unit smooth muscle, so that's going to be found in most of the places in the body. The reason it's called single unit smooth muscle is because the cells are all connected by gap junctions, and so they all contract at the same time as a single unit. Some of the single unit smooth muscle cells have pacemaker activity, so they are actually able to generate their own action potentials without anybody telling them to do that. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. The other type of smooth muscle is multi-unit smooth muscle. So these smooth muscle cells are not joined by gap junctions, and so they're each going to contract individually on their own. They will each be innervated by their own neuron, and so they actually will form motor units. Where we find multi-unit smooth muscle in the body would be in the large airways, some of the large arteries, in the eye, and then also around the hair follicles that gives you goosebumps when those smooth muscles contract. Here's a picture just showing you the difference between single unit smooth muscle. So single unit smooth muscle is on the bottom, and you can see that these cells are all joined by gap junctions. So they're all going to contract as a single unit. And then on the top we have the multi-unit smooth muscle. And so you can see that the cells are not connected by gap junctions, so they're going to contract independently of each other. In some single unit smooth muscle cells, they are autorhythmic, meaning that they can generate their own action potentials all by themselves. We're going to see that again when we get to cardiac muscle. So there's two ways that single unit smooth muscle cells can spontaneously depolarize and reach threshold. So the first way is they could create these pacemaker potentials. So they just spontaneously depolarize, reach threshold, get an action potential, they contract, relax, and then they do it over again. We can also have slow wave potentials where the resting membrane potential is not stable and it will actually fluctuate. So sometimes they reach threshold and get an action potential, and sometimes they don't. We see this pacemaker activity especially in the smooth muscle in the GI tract. So for example, in the small intestine, they have a rate of slow wave potentials of about 10 to 20 per minute. And then in the colon, it's much slower. Their slow wave potentials happen about have about 3 to 8 every minute. Here's a picture of single unit smooth muscle, and notice the gap junctions connecting the cells. And the smooth muscle cell on the top has pacemaker activity, so it's spontaneously depolarizing, reaching threshold, generating an action potential, and then that action potential will travel to all the other single unit smooth muscle cells, and then they will all contract as a single unit.